Michael Dennis saw Elizabeth Clark for the first time at a charity reception for the arts. She stood at a high window in a long burgundy dress, and the rays of the setting sun created a golden halo around her silhouette. Michael, usually reserved in showing emotion, felt his breath catch. He would later confess to his friends that it was love at first sight. "James, who is this woman?" he asked his friend, trying not to give away his excitement. James Carter, stirring the whiskey in his glass, followed Michael's gaze. "Elizabeth Clark, a rising star in the world of interior design. Talented, intelligent, and, as you can see, beautiful. Would you like to meet her?" Their first date was at a small Italian restaurant. Michael was as nervous as a schoolboy, but Elizabeth knew how to create an atmosphere of lightness and warmth. Her deep brown eyes shone with sincerity, and her low, chesty laugh made others turn around. "You're not like any other financier I've ever met," she said then. "There's something real." During their 2-year relationship, they learned a lot about each other, but not everything. Michael talked about his conservative family in Boston, the pressure his father put on him, his desire to escape the shadow of parental expectations. Elizabeth talked about her art, her travels in Europe, her dreams of opening her own design studio. But some pages of her past remained closed. Asterisk, asterisk, asterisk. Michael and Elizabeth's wedding was the talk of the town. The old church covered in white peonies and roses, the glitter of crystal at the reception, the champagne flowing like a fairy tale. The bride in a gown by a famous designer seemed the epitome of grace and beauty. "I've never seen you so happy," Michael whispered as they twirled in the first dance. Elizabeth smiled, but a shadow flickered in the depths of her eyes. "This is the most important day of my life," she said. "I want it to never end." One by one, the guests came up with congratulations. Michael's parents, prim and elegant, discreetly embraced their daughter-in-law. "Welcome to the family, dear," Michael's mother said with a carefully rehearsed smile. "You're Dennis now, don't forget that." The father patted his son on the shoulder. "Excellent choice, son. A real lady, you can tell." Elizabeth felt Michael tense up. Family approval meant more to him than he wanted to admit. While the guests enjoyed the gourmet meal, Veronica Hayes, Elizabeth's best friend, took the bride aside. They secluded themselves in a small sitting room next to the banquet hall. "You have to tell him," Veronica said quietly but insistently, nervously adjusting the bridesmaid's aquamarine dress. "Tonight, Elizabeth. Before—" "Not now," Elizabeth cut her off. "I'll find the right moment." "When? On the honeymoon? A year from now? You're getting married, damn it." Veronica took her friend's hands in her own. "I know you're afraid of losing him, but if he really loves you—" "He wouldn't understand." Elizabeth had tears in her eyes. "You don't know his family, the way he was raised. What if he—" There was a knock on the door, and the women pulled away from each other. "Elizabeth, the wedding coordinator is looking for you for a group photo," came James Carter's voice. "We'll be right out," Elizabeth replied, hurriedly blotting her eyes with a napkin. As the door closed, Veronica squeezed her friend's shoulder. "Just remember, the longer you put it off, the worse it will get. One more thing. That James guy, he's looking at you strangely." "James?" Elizabeth was surprised. "He's Michael's best friend. And you don't notice the way he looks at you?" Veronica shook her head. "Be careful with him. Does he know?" Elizabeth nodded slowly. "He found out by accident, but swore to keep my secret. Asterisk, asterisk, asterisk." Throughout the evening, James Carter did behave unusually. When toasting the newlyweds, he often stammered and avoided looking at Elizabeth. During the dance, he drank a lot, and when Michael asked him to take a picture with them, James awkwardly hugged his friend, keeping a noticeable distance from the bride. "What's wrong with him today?" Michael whispered to his wife as they walked away from the guests. "Probably nervous about the speech," Elizabeth tried to smile. "Not everyone is as fond of public speaking as you are." Later, when the banquet was in full swing, James approached the bar where Elizabeth was waiting for her glass of champagne. "Beautiful wedding," he said without looking her in the eye. You look amazing." "Thank you, James," she replied demurely. "Did you tell him?" he asked suddenly, lowering his voice. Elizabeth tensed. "Not yet, but it's none of your business." "He's my best friend, Elizabeth." James sounded hurt. I shouldn't have kept such a secret from him. It wasn't right. You gave your word, her eyes flashed, and I said I would tell him myself. Tonight. James looked at her for a long moment. I hope you know what you're doing. Michael, he's not as understanding as you think. Asterisk, asterisk, asterisk. In the presidential suite of the Azure Palace Hotel, the newlyweds were finally alone. Elizabeth walked slowly to the panoramic window that offered a view of the city at night. She was still in her wedding dress, and Michael had already removed his jacket and loosened his tie. I can't believe we're finally married, he said, coming up behind her and putting his arm around her waist. Mrs. Dennis. Elizabeth covered his hands with her own, but her body remained tense. Michael, she said quietly, we need to talk. He turned her around to face him and kissed her gently. About what, love? What could be so important right now? Elizabeth pulled away and took a deep breath. There is something you need to know about me, something I haven't told you. Michael frowned. Sounds serious. You're scaring me. Please, just hear me out, she pleaded. And remember that I'm the same Elizabeth you fell in love with. Nothing is going to change that. Michael slowly lowered himself into the chair, keeping his eyes on her. Elizabeth began to talk. About her childhood, about how she had always felt out of her body, about the journey she had taken to become her real self. She talked and talked, watching the expression on her husband's face change from confusion to shock, from shock to disbelief. You mean, his voice trembled. You used to be a man? I've always been a woman, Michael, she answered firmly. Just born in a different body. And you, he swallowed. You haven't completed the transition. Elizabeth shook her head. I was planning on having the surgery in 6 months. I wanted to be completely honest with you before then, but I was afraid of losing you the whole time. Michael stood up, his face stony. All this time? 2 years? You've been lying to me about the most fundamental thing. I didn't lie about who I am. Tears streamed down her face. I loved you every minute of it. This is real. Real? His voice was rising. What's real, Elizabeth? Or whatever your real name is? Elizabeth, she whispered. That's my real name. The one I've always been on the inside. Michael paced the room, running his hands through his hair. I can't believe it. My parents, what are they gonna say? God, the whole town's gonna laugh at me. Michael, please, Elizabeth begged. Think of me, of us. It doesn't change our love. Love! He turned sharply toward her. Do you think it's love to deceive a man like this? I don't even know who you are. Their voices grew louder and louder. In the neighboring room, an elderly couple, awakened by the noise, looked at each other worriedly. Should we call the front desk? The woman asked the husband. There's obviously some kind of quarrel. It's the newlyweds from the presidential suite, the man replied. It's their first marital spat. They'll make up in the morning. In the room across the hall, a young woman took off her headphones and listened to the sounds behind the wall. She clearly heard a man screaming, "You ruined my life," and then the sound of breaking glass. Asterisk, asterisk, asterisk. The morning was sunny and clear. Maria Rodriguez, a maid at the Azure Palace Hotel, knocked quietly on the door of the presidential suite. Housekeeping, she said in a low voice. Receiving no answer, she knocked again, louder. Silence. Maria knew that the newlyweds had to leave by 11 o'clock in the morning, and it was now early 11 o'clock. She used her keycard and carefully opened the door. Excuse me, Mr. and Mrs. Dennis? Checkout time? Her sentence was cut off halfway through. In the middle of the luxurious room, on the snow-white carpet, lay a woman in a tattered wedding dress. There was a dark red stain around her head and a gun lying nearby. Behind the ajar bathroom door could be seen a male figure sitting on the edge of a huge marble tub with his head down. Maria Rodriguez screamed and dropped her keychain. With trembling hands, she pulled out her cell phone and dialed 9111. Police? Her voice trailed off. At the Azure Palace Hotel, room 216. I think there's been a murder. Please hurry. Detective Rachel Morgan parked her squad car at the main entrance of the Azure Palace Hotel. Police tape already fenced off the area, and a crowd of onlookers had gathered at the door. Morgan pulled out her badge and showed it to the officer on duty. "Detective Morgan, homicide," she introduced herself. "What do we got?" "Newlywed, with a gunshot wound to the head," the officer replied. "Husband found in the bathroom in a state of shock. Presidential suite, 216. Rachel nodded and headed for the elevators. She'd seen a lot of things in her 45 years, but murder on her wedding night was something new even for her. Stepping out on the second floor, she immediately saw the excitement around the presidential suite. Forensic experts in white suits were collecting evidence. A photographer was capturing the crime scene, and the medical examiner was already examining the body. "Dr. Lee," Morgan said as she entered the room. "What can you tell me?" Dr. Lee, a lean Asian man with attentive eyes, straightened up. Single gunshot wound to the head, entry wound to the right temple. Death occurred between 2 o'clock and 4 a.m. I'll know more after the autopsy. Morgan crouched down next to the body. The young woman in the tattered wedding dress looked like a broken porcelain doll. The detective noticed a thin gold chain with a bird-shaped pendant around the victim's neck. "Weapon?" she asked, looking around. "Glock pistol, 9 caliber, one of the CSIs answered, pointing to a plastic bag of evidence. "Found next to the body. It has prints that match those of the husband, Michael Dennis." "Where is he now?" "He's in the next room with Officer Ramirez. Hasn't said a word since we found him. Looks like traumatic shock." Morgan nodded and looked around the room. Broken glasses on the floor, an overturned table, scattered items, all indicating a violent altercation. "Check all the security cameras," she ordered. "I want information on who went in and out of the room last night." Asterisk, asterisk, asterisk. Michael Dennis sat on the edge of the bed in the next room, staring into the space in front of him. His white shirt was stained with blood, his hair disheveled. When Morgan walked in, he didn't even look up. "Mr. Dennis," she began quietly. "I'm Detective Rachel Morgan. I need to ask you some questions about what happened last night." Michael slowly shifted his gaze to her. His eyes were empty, like a man who has lost everything. "She's dead," he said quietly. "Elizabeth is dead." "Yes, Mr. Dennis, and I'm trying to figure out what happened. Can you help me?" He swallowed and ran his hand over his face. "We had a fight," he began. "A big one." "About what?" Michael looked up at her with an expression of helplessness. She told me something. About herself. Something I didn't know." "And what was that?" Morgan asked softly. Michael shook his head, his eyes filling with tears. "I can't. It's personal. Mr. Dennis, your wife is dead. A gun with your fingerprints on it was found in the room. There's nothing more personal than that." Morgan's voice got harder. "What did she tell you?" He was silent for a long time, then barely audible. "She was a man. Before we met." Morgan didn't let the surprise show on her face. "She'd made the transgender transition?" Michael nodded and covered his face with his hands. "And she didn't complete it. I found that out when we—" He didn't finish the sentence. "I was in shock. We yelled at each other. I said terrible things. And then I went to the bathroom. I needed to be alone to process it all. I heard her crying. And then there was a gunshot." His voice broke. "I swear I didn't kill her. Does the gun belong to you, Mr. Dennis?" "Yes." He looked up at her. "I keep it in my suitcase, for safety. But I didn't reach for it yesterday. I don't know how she got it." "Did you hear anything else before the gunshot? Voices? Footsteps? Maybe someone coming into the room?" Michael frowned, trying to remember. "No. I don't know. I was in such a state. I took a sedative and I think I dozed off in the bathroom, and when I came out and I saw her..." He put his hands over his face again. "I couldn't believe it. I just sat there looking at her. And then the maid came in and screamed." Morgan asked a few more questions, but Michael had little to add. The story sounded lame, but the shock in his eyes seemed genuine. Asterisk, asterisk, asterisk. Back in the presidential suite, Morgan approached one of the forensics guys. "What about the gun?" "Glock 17, registered to Michael Dennis 2 years ago. One shot, prints are mostly his, but some smudges, probably the victim's. No powder residue on the suspect's hands, but he could have washed it off." "Suicide?" "Unlikely. The angle of entry of the bullet is inconsistent. Also, there are bruises on the victim's neck and wrists, possibly from entrapment." Morgan nodded. and began examining the contents of Elizabeth's purse. Among the makeup and personal items, she found a vial of hormone medication, confirming Michael's story. "Check the guest lists for the wedding," she ordered. "I need the names and contacts of the couple's closest friends." Asterisk, asterisk, asterisk. Over the next few hours, Morgan interviewed several of the hotel guests whose rooms were next to the president's. An elderly couple confirmed that they heard a loud argument around midnight. "At first we thought it was just a marital spat," the woman said. "But then the screaming got so loud." The man was furious. "Did you hear a gunshot?" "No," the husband replied. "After the argument, it got quiet. We thought they had made up or left." The girl in the room across the hall said more. "I heard him yelling, 'You ruined my life!' And then something broke. Then it got quiet, but about an hour later, I heard a door slam. I can't tell you exactly, but I think someone was coming out of their room." "What time was that?" "About 2 o'clock in the morning. I was just getting ready for bed." Morgan noted it in her notebook. If someone left the room after an argument, it could change the entire crime scene. Asterisk, 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 Veronica Hayes, a friend of the bride's, arrived at the hotel a few hours after the police call. She was pale and confused. "I can't believe it," she repeated, sitting across from Morgan in the hotel lobby. "Just yesterday we were dancing at her wedding." "Miss Hayes, were you close to Elizabeth?" the detective asked. "We've been friends for 5 years, ever since she moved to town." Veronica clutched her handkerchief. "I was by her side during the transition." "So you knew about her past?" Veronica nodded. "From the beginning, I supported her every step of the way. She was so afraid of people finding out, especially Michael." "Did you advise her to tell her husband?" "Of course I did," Veronica exclaimed. "Yesterday at the wedding, I begged her to tell him before the wedding night. But she was so afraid of his reaction." Her voice trailed off. "If she'd listened to me, maybe she'd still be alive." "What do you think of Michael? Is he capable of murder?" Veronica hesitated. "I don't know. He seemed so in love. But his family is very conservative. I was always afraid that if he found out the truth, he wouldn't accept Elizabeth." "Who else knew about her past?" "Not many. Her doctor, of course, her parents, but they hadn't spoken in a while. She hesitated. "James Carter. Michael's best friend?" Morgan was surprised. "Yeah, he found out by accident about a year ago. Promised to keep the secret, but I never trusted him. He looked at Elizabeth strangely, as if..." She stammered again. "I think he was in love with her." That was interesting information. Morgan made a note to check where James Carter was the night of the murder. "Did Elizabeth have a diary or something?" she asked. "Something where she could write down her thoughts?" Veronica nodded. "Yes, she kept an electronic diary on her laptop, and also an old-fashioned paper notebook that she always carried with her. She called it her fear vault. Asterisk, asterisk, asterisk. The electronic diary was password protected, but the paper notebook was in Elizabeth's suitcase. Morgan read it while sitting at a desk in the hotel office. The pages were scribbled in neat handwriting. "Michael proposed to me today," Elizabeth had written 2 months ago. "I am the happiest woman in the world, and the most frightened. How will I tell him? And when? It's getting harder every day. He loves me as he sees me. But will he love me when he knows the truth? And then, Veronica says I should confess before I get married. She's right, I know. But what if he leaves? What if he looks at me with disgust? I can't survive that. Maybe it'll be easier after the surgery, when everything physically changes. But it's selfish to tie him up in a marriage under false pretenses. I hate myself for this deception, but I'm even more afraid of losing him." In the records of the past month, a new concern has appeared. "James was strange today. Said he can't keep my secret from Michael anymore, that it wasn't fair to his friend. I begged him to give me time. He agreed, but there's something different in his eyes. It's like he's blaming me, or worse, pitying Michael." The last entry was made on the eve of the wedding. "Tomorrow I'll be Mrs. Dennis. Sounds like a dream come true, but one confession stands between me and my happiness. I've decided I'm going to tell him tonight before we're together as husband and wife. If he really loves me, and I believe he does, he'll understand. And if he doesn't understand right away, I'll give him time. The main thing is no more lies. I want to start our married life with a clean slate. God, I'm so afraid. Morgan closed the notebook with a heavy feeling. Elizabeth had described her fear so vividly that it seemed tangible, and apparently, her worst fears had been realized. Asterisk, asterisk, asterisk. To complete the picture, we needed to know more about Elizabeth's past. Morgan contacted the police department in the victim's hometown and asked for information on Elizabeth Clark before the change of identity. Her name used to be Andrew Clark, an out-of-state colleague informed her. Normal guy, no priors. Worked as a designer, just like he does now. Changed his name and gender on the paperwork 5 years ago, all legal. Parents were kind of against it, but there's no official conflict on record. What about photos? Anything? I'll send you what I can find. But I'm warning you, she's changed a lot. If it wasn't for the paperwork, no one would have connected the two identities. The emailed photos confirmed what he said. Andrew Clark was a thin young man with soft features and sad eyes. Elizabeth Clark, even before all the cosmetic procedures, looked much more feminine and, most importantly, happier. I think she's found herself, Morgan muttered as she studied the pictures. A phone call interrupted her musings. Detective Morgan? It was the duty officer's voice. There's a visitor for you, James Carter. Says he has important information about the Dennis case. Asterisk, 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 James Carter was nervously tugging at the hem of his jacket as he sat in the interrogation room. He had dark circles under his eyes and his hands were trembling slightly. Thank you for coming in, Mr. Carter, Morgan began, sitting down across from him. You said you had information about Elizabeth Dennis's death? I should have been here sooner, he blurted out. But I couldn't. I couldn't believe it had happened. What exactly happened, Mr. Carter? He took a deep breath. Michael called me last night. For about an hour, he was furious, yelling into the phone. Said that Elizabeth had tricked him, that he stammered, that she wasn't who she said she was. Did he mention her transgender status? James looked at Morgan in surprise. Yes, so you already know. Go on, what else did he say? He was out of his mind. He said his life was ruined, that everyone would laugh at him, that his parents would die of shame. He never could control his emotions, but I'd never heard him like that before. Did he threaten Elizabeth? James lowered his eyes. He said he'd rather she was dead than continue to dishonor him. Morgan watched his reaction carefully. And what was your response? I tried to calm him down. I told him I'd be there, that we'd talk about it. But he hung up. Did you go to him? No, James shook his head. And now I can't forgive myself. If I'd gone, maybe I could have prevented it. Mr. Carter, did you know about Elizabeth's past before this call? He looked up at her with eyes full of pain. Yes, I found out by accident about a year ago. Elizabeth begged me not to tell Michael, said she would do it herself when she was ready. And you agreed to keep her secret? Yes, even though I felt like I was betraying my friend. But I couldn't. He stopped talking. Couldn't what, Mr. Carter? Couldn't hurt her, he answered quietly. Elizabeth was special. Morgan looked at him carefully. Were you in love with her? James looked as if he had been punched. After a moment, he nodded slowly. I fell in love with her almost as soon as Michael introduced us. But she loved him. Always just him. Where were you last night between midnight and 4 in the morning? In my apartment? He frowned. Wait a minute, you don't think? In a murder case, Mr. Carter, we have to vet everyone. Can anyone confirm your whereabouts? No, I was alone, but I would never... He hesitated, then straightened up. Do you have my cell phone number? Yes, Morgan answered, not sure what he was getting at. Check my phone's location data. I haven't left the house. Morgan nodded, making a note of it. One more thing, James added, running his hand over his face. Michael kept a gun in his suitcase. He showed it to me once, bragging about it. Said he always took it on trips, for safety. Morgan closed her notebook. Thank you for the information, Mr. Carter. We'll check it out. If you think of anything else, please contact me. When he left, the detective stared at the closed door for a long time. There were more and more layers to this case, and underneath each one lurked a new mystery. A mystery that Elizabeth Dennis may have paid for with her life. The next morning, Detective Rachel Morgan sat in her office going through the case files. Elizabeth Dennis's death seemed like an obvious hate crime committed by an angry spouse, but Morgan couldn't shake the feeling that she was missing something important. A phone call brought her out of her reverie. Morgan speaking. Detective, this is Officer Clark. I contacted Michael Dennis's parents at your request. They're in town now, staying at the Grand Hotel. They're demanding to see their son. Thanks, Clark. I'm on it. The Dennis family was Boston's elite. Old money, old principles. If rumors of Elizabeth's transgender status got out, it would be a huge scandal. Could that be a motive for murder? Fear of social stigma often drives people to extreme measures. Asterisk, asterisk, asterisk. Victor and Diane Dennis looked as if they had stepped off the pages of a glossy magazine. Perfect hairstyles, impeccably tailored clothes, masks of calm on their faces. Only their eyes betrayed their inner tension. We need to see our son, Victor said as Morgan entered the hotel room. Immediately. Mr. Dennis is under investigation for the murder of his wife, Morgan replied dryly. We'll be able to meet with him after the arraignment. There must be some mistake, Diana interjected, her impeccably manicured fingers clutching a handkerchief. Michael is incapable of murder. Did you know Elizabeth? Morgan asked, watching their reactions carefully. The couple exchanged quick glances. Of course, Victor replied. She was our son's wife. And what did you think of her? Again, they exchanged glances. Diana spoke first. She was charming, beautiful, educated. Not our type, of course, but Michael was always stubborn when he got in his head. Did you know about her past? Morgan asked me bluntly. Victor's face froze. What past are you talking about, detective? Morgan held his gaze calmly. About Elizabeth being a transgender woman, formerly known as Andrew Clark. The silence in the room became palpable. Diana turned pale and pressed her handkerchief to her lips. Victor sank slowly into a chair. That's impossible, he said at last. You're wrong. We have medical documents to prove it. Your son learned the truth on their wedding night. After that, there was an argument and Elizabeth was found dead. Diana made a strange sound, like a sob. Oh my God, Victor. The scandal. The newspapers. Shut up, Diana, her husband cut her off abruptly. He looked at Morgan with obvious hostility. It's absurd. Our son could not marry. Such a person. Someone misled him, fooled him, and now they're trying to frame him. So you believe Michael is innocent? Of course he is. He may have lost control when he learned the truth. But murder? No. Victor lowered his voice. Look, detective, we can work this out. Quietly, quietly. The Dennis family has influence and resources. Morgan smiled coldly. Are you trying to bribe a police officer, Mr. Dennis? I'm trying to protect my son and my family's reputation. He stepped forward. What do you want? A position? A promotion? Money? Name it. Morgan stood up. The conversation was over. I want justice for the woman who was murdered, Mr. Dennis. And the truth. Now, unless you have any relevant information, I must continue my investigation. On the doorstep, she turned around. One more question. Where were you both last night between midnight and 4 o'clock in the morning? Diana looked fearfully at her husband, but Victor didn't flinch. We were at home in Boston. All the staff can confirm. Thank you. Morgan nodded. Goodbye. Stepping outside, she took a deep breath. The Dennis family had reason to want Elizabeth dead. A transgender daughter-in-law would be an indelible stain on the clan's reputation. But could they have organized a murder from a distance? Asterisk, asterisk, asterisk. Back at headquarters, Morgan checked the results of the investigation into the alibis of key figures. Michael Dennis was in the hotel room, as confirmed by the security footage. James Carter was indeed at home. His phone's geolocation data matched what he said. Veronica Hayes spent the night in her apartment, as confirmed by a neighbor who saw her around midnight and in the morning. The most interesting thing, however, came to light in the hotel's security footage. A figure wearing dark clothing and a baseball cap hiding his face was recorded in the presidential floor hallway leading to the newlyweds' suite. The person approached the door of room 216 at 1 hour and 37 minutes past midnight and left approximately 10 minutes later. The identity of the visitor could not be determined because of the camera angle, but it was a man of average height. It could be anyone, Morgan muttered as she watched the tape a third time. A hotel employee, a random guest, or the killer. The new evidence required further scrutiny. Morgan called the hotel manager. "I need the footage from all the cameras in the hotel from last night, especially the cameras at the entrance and in the parking lot." "Of course, detective. We're already sending you the full archive." Asterisk, asterisk, asterisk. James Carter sat in the interrogation room for the second time in 2 days. This time, he looked even more exhausted. "Thank you for coming in, Mr. Carter," Morgan began. "I have some new questions." "I'll do whatever I can to help," he replied tiredly. "Elizabeth deserves justice." Morgan watched him carefully, trying to read his emotions. "Yesterday you admitted that you had romantic feelings for Elizabeth. How deep were they?" James lowered his eyes. "I loved her," he said quietly, "from the first day Michael introduced us. But she'd never looked at me like that. Michael was all there was to her. Even after you found out her secret?" "Especially after that." He looked up. "You know, a lot of people would turn away if they knew the truth. I didn't. I accepted her for who she was. All of her, and Michael." He shook his head. "I knew he couldn't. Too dependent on his family's opinion, their approval. Were you hoping Elizabeth would turn to you when Michael rejected her?" James smiled painfully. "That sounds awful, doesn't it? But yes, somewhere in the back of my mind I hoped. I would never intentionally ruin their relationship. But if that had happened, I'd be there for her, waiting for her. You said you were home all night last night, but hotel security footage shows a man entering the Dennis's room after midnight, around the time of the murder." James went pale. "You think it was me? I never left my apartment. I swear to you. Check my phone, my computer, anything." "We already did. Your phone was indeed in your apartment all night, but you could have left it at home." "Why would I kill Elizabeth?" He sounded desperate. "I loved her. Sometimes love is the motive, Mr. Carter. If not for me, then for no one is a common logic among murderers." James dropped his head on his hands. "I didn't kill her. I couldn't have, not even for her own sake." "What do you mean?" He looked up slowly. "I mean that no matter how horrible her future with Michael might be after the truth was revealed, I would never have spared her in that way. I believed she deserved to be happy, even if not with me." Morgan watched him carefully. Either James Carter was telling the truth, or he was an excellent actor. Asterisk, asterisk, asterisk. Veronica Hayes was waiting in the adjoining interrogation room. When Morgan entered, she was nervously fidgeting with the bracelet on her wrist. "Miss Hayes, there's something you're not telling me," the detective began without preamble. "What else do you know about Elizabeth's death?" Veronica flinched. "I've told you everything I know, I swear." "You knew Elizabeth well, were her closest friend, supportive during her transgender transition. She must have shared her fears, her hopes, problems." Veronica suddenly burst into tears. Through her tears, she said, "The last weeks before the wedding, she received messages, threatening ones. Why didn't you tell me this before? She forbade me." Veronica wiped her tears. "Said she could handle it on her own." "What kind of messages?" "Emails, someone threatening to expose her, tell Michael about her past, demanding hush money." "Do you have those emails?" "No, Elizabeth didn't forward them to me, but she was very scared." "Did she say who might have sent them?" Veronica shook her head. "She didn't know, but she suspected." She hesitated. "Who did she suspect, Miss Hayes?" "James Carter," Veronica answered quietly. "After he'd accidentally found out her secret. She said he changed, became strange. Sometimes he looked at her, frightening." "Do you think he's capable of murder?" Veronica sighed. "I don't know. I used to say no. But lately, his obsession with Elizabeth was becoming more and more noticeable. He might have exploded upon learning that she'd married Michael after all, despite the possibility of scandal." The new information added another motive to the case, but Morgan still wasn't sure. Her intuition told her that something else was involved. Asterisk, asterisk, asterisk. The ballistics report on the gun and bullet was ready by the end of the day. Morgan was scrutinizing the report when there was a knock on the door. "Come in." She looked up from the papers. It was Officer Ramirez. "Detective, you asked me to let you know if there was any news on the hotel security footage. We found something interesting." He placed a clipboard with an open video file in front of her. "This is footage from a camera in the hotel's underground parking lot. 2 o'clock in the morning. A man in dark clothes and a baseball cap walks out to his car." Morgan stared at the screen. The figure was similar to the one captured by the camera in the hallway. The man walked briskly toward a car parked in the shadows, his face still obscured. But then, as he got into the car, he turned toward the light for a moment. "Stop," Morgan said. "Zoom in on that shot." Ramirez followed the command. A blurred but recognizable face appeared on the screen. "Send this frame to enhancement and request a license plate number," Morgan ordered. "I think we have a new suspect." When Ramirez left, she turned back to the ballistics report. What she read changed the entire picture of the crime. Asterisk. 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 That evening, Morgan gathered everyone involved in the investigation in a conference room at the police department. Michael Dennis sat accompanied by his attorney. James Carter drummed his fingers nervously on the table. Veronica Hayes looked pale and exhausted. Michael's parents, Victor and Diane Dennis, sat in the corner with stone faces. "Thank you all for coming," Morgan began. "Over the past 2 days, we've gathered enough evidence to press charges for Elizabeth Dennis's murder." There was a tense silence in the room. "Facts first," Morgan continued. "Elizabeth Dennis was killed with a 9mm Glock pistol belonging to her husband, Michael Dennis. The death occurred between 2 and 3 o'clock in the morning. Michael's fingerprints, and in part Elizabeth's own, were found at the scene. Judging from the signs of a struggle and witness testimony, there had been a violent altercation prior to the murder, related to the disclosure of secrets about the victim's transgender status." She shifted her gaze to Michael. "Mr. Dennis claims he was in the bathroom when the murder took place and didn't hear the gunshot. That could explain the lack of gunpowder residue on his hands. However," Morgan paused. "The ballistics test revealed something interesting. The angle of entry of the bullet and the trajectory of the shot are not consistent with either a suicide or a murder committed by a man standing across from the victim. The shot was fired from the side and slightly overhead." She pulled out an enlarged photograph. In addition, hotel surveillance footage showed a man entering the Dennis's room after midnight and leaving about 10 minutes later. The same person was later seen in the parking lot getting into a car. Morgan turned to James. "Mr. Carter, you claim to have spent the entire night at home, and your phone's geolocation data confirms it. But you neglected to mention that you have a second phone, a work phone that you left at home." James turned pale, but didn't say a word. "You also failed to mention that you sent Elizabeth threatening messages in the final weeks before the wedding, blackmailing her, demanding money to keep quiet about her past." "That's not true," James exclaimed. "I would never—" "We have the IP address from which the messages were sent," Morgan interrupted him. "It matches the address of your home computer." James looked shocked. "Someone is setting me up. I loved her, I swear." "Maybe," Morgan nodded. "That's why we checked the footage from the street camera in front of your house. You left the apartment at 12 hours and 45 minutes and returned at 2 hours and 30 minutes. Enough time to drive to the hotel, commit the murder, and drive back." James put his head down on his hands. "I didn't kill her. I would never—" "We also checked your car," Morgan continued. "We found traces of gunpowder in the trunk, and in the glove compartment, a pair of gloves with microscopic traces of Elizabeth's blood." "That's impossible!" James's face contorted. "I wasn't at the hotel that night." "The man on the security camera footage," Morgan placed an enlarged photograph on the table. "That's you, Mr. Carter." Silence reigned in the room. James stared at the photograph with horror. "Yeah, I don't understand," he whispered. "Let me explain what happened," Morgan said. "You were in love with Elizabeth from the moment you met her. But she chose your friend, Michael. When you accidentally found out her secret, it gave you a chance, either to ruin their relationship by telling Michael the truth, or to make Elizabeth pay attention to you by becoming her protector, the keeper of her secret." She stepped closer to James. "But she was still going to marry Michael. Then you started blackmailing her, hoping to get, if not her feelings, at least her money. Or perhaps you wanted to scare her enough to call off the wedding. But the plan didn't work. Morgan shifted her gaze to Michael. The night of the murder, you called Mr. Carter in a rage, told him about Elizabeth's deception. Maybe even said something like, "I wish she were dead." And that gave him an idea. If he couldn't have Elizabeth, and Michael had given up on her too, why not get rid of her and frame his friend at the same time? "This is crazy," James whispered. "I loved her. So much so that you'd rather see her dead than with another man," Morgan said sharply. "You came to the hotel knowing that Michael was in shock and probably sedated. You knew about the gun in his suitcase. You shot Elizabeth, knowing that all the evidence would point to her husband." James stared straight ahead, his eyes blank. "She didn't have to die," he said finally. "I just wanted to talk, to convince her. The gun. I took it to scare her, to make her listen to me. But she laughed, said she'd never love someone like me, that even if Michael left her, she'd never—" His voice broke. "I didn't mean to shoot. It just happened on its own." There was a heavy silence in the room. Officer Ramirez approached James and read him his rights. "James Carter, you are under arrest for the murder of Elizabeth Dennis. Asterisk, asterisk, asterisk." 3 days later, Detective Rachel Morgan stood at Elizabeth Dennis's grave. The funeral ceremony was modest, just a few friends and Veronica Hayes crying by the casket. Michael Dennis did not attend. Later, walking down the cemetery avenue, Morgan reflected on what had happened. Behind James's mask of love was obsession. Behind the mask of Michael's perfect husband was prejudice and selfishness. And behind Elizabeth's mask of confidence was fear of rejection. "We all wear masks," Morgan thought, "showing the world only what we want it to see. But sometimes the cost of playing that game becomes prohibitive." A phone call interrupted her musings. A new case, new masks to be torn off. Detective Morgan took a deep breath and headed for the car. The job was never over, and the dead could never be helped. Only the living, those left to wear their masks further.